In this second module of the DBXL training, we will be covering the steps needed to map your form data into SQL. So DBXL is going to allow you to create this mapping between your XML forms and your SQL tables. And obviously the prerequisite for this is that your InfoPath form submits to DBXL without errors, without issues, and we've precisely done that in the Module 1. We can see here that this is set up and it has a document that we submitted successfully. So we're going to build on this example by going to the database tab, and we're gonna build our database mapping via this interface that you're seeing right now on my screen. The first thing we need, however, is we need a destination for this data. So we have to go to SQL Server Management Studio first, and I have created a database called DBXL, no, that's not it, DBXL Training. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a table that is going to allow us to store our InfoPath form data. And let's let this load. Okay. Now, how do we know what columns to add here? Well, it really depends on your reporting needs, right? If we go back to the InfoPath form in design mode, we can take a look at this schema, and we see a lot of fields, right? Even though we collect all of these fields in the InfoPath form, you might not need all of those in SQL. So this is the concept of loosely coupled, right? Your InfoPath form is collecting this data schema. Your SQL table could also store this entire schema, or it could store a portion of it. So what we're going to illustrate first in this training module is just to collect a portion of the data in SQL. So I'm going to try to put this side by side just to have this make some sense. Here we go. So I have my InfoPath form schema on the right, and I have SQL Server Management Studio on the left. And I'm going to start adding fields. So let's say that I want to collect the data for employee name. Let's say I want to collect the email address. Let's say that I'm not concerned with the job title or the department, but the identification number matters. So that takes care of our employee group. So let's look down at the manager group. Let's say that all I need is the manager name. And I'm just randomly picking and choosing here, right? Your reporting needs might differ. Let's say I need the expense code, the start date, the end date, the report date, and the purpose. So let's start off with that. That's a good data set to start off with. Now, when designing a SQL table, you want to make sure that you have a unique identifier. You have a key, right? Perhaps from looking at this data, we can't identify a key. Maybe, the employee name is not unique. The employee email is not unique. Oh, I just saw a mistake here, so let me fix that. We look at this data and we discover that there's no unique value here. So let's say that I'm going to map the doc ID. The doc ID comes from DBXL. Now, whether you choose to allow nulls or not that's again up to you. When mapping the doc ID, you do not want to allow nulls because that's actually our key. So I just right-clicked here and select set primary key. And let's say that I'm going to leave the other ones as allow nulls. Again, you can uncheck these if you want. For data type, I have labeled a lot of these as nvarchar 50, but of course your data type might be different. Let me just illustrate with one example. I'm not going to go through all of the fields, but I'm just going to illustrate with one example. So let's say that the purpose, I want to limit the purpose to 100 characters, right? If I'm going to place this limit in the SQL database, then I might as well place that limit as well in the InfoPath form. So I can go to the text box properties, and I can limit the text box to 100 characters. So it's a good thing to keep in mind, just to improve the user experience, right? So that when the user submits, they know that the data they have typed in is going into SQL without issues. So we're limiting the text box to 100 characters, and we're limiting the purpose in the database to 100 characters. Let's say that it has to be filled out, so it cannot be null. So in the form, how do we do that? In the form, we make this required. So we checked cannot be blank. And that's going to place an asterisk, and the user is going to see that that's labeled as required in the form, so they know that they have to fill that out. And like I said, I'm just doing this for the one field purpose, but you could go through all of these and perform the same thing. For example, let's say that expense code is just 10 characters. So I can go into my expense code field here and limit it to 10 characters, and so on. It's a long exercise, but it pays off in the end because you're going to be avoiding a lot of issues that arise later out of data type conflicts. So let me save that table, and I will call this expense report. Obviously, if you're performing the steps to this module, you don't have access to the same SQL instance, but you should have access to a SQL instance, maybe locally, maybe internally to your company. So feel free to use that to perform these. If you are performing this on our server, then just follow along with the settings that I will use, and it should be able to connect you. I have made sure that you all have permissions. So now that my table has been set up, I have to recall that I have made 2 changes to my InfoPath form. So I should definitely save this, and I will call this lab 2 expense report. And I will return to the database administration tool. We want to set up the mapping. Now, you'll notice the first field here that we have is the connection string. And the documentation, the training module, has an example of a connection string that you can use. And if that's not working in your environment, let us know. Sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error to get the connection string perfectly. But the one trick here is, let's just return to the catalog, and let's go to one of the examples here, one of the system document types. So these are needed for the internal workings of DBXL. If I just go to one of these, I'm going to go to the database tab, and I'm going to see a connection string. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to mimic that in my new document type. And the reason I do that is, this is the connection string that the installer defined. So we know it works. Installation worked. DBXL is working. So we know the connection string works. We just have to change the initial catalog, because we're not mapping the data into Qdabra DBXL. We're mapping the data into the DBXL Training database. And I will just save that. When I save, DBXL goes out and connects to the database. It ensures that everything's correct. And now that that's done, I can start adding my mapping. The first link here that you see in the database map section says add table. So I click on that and I get a table name dropdown. So this dropdown has the tables that I have permissions. You'll see that it has a couple of views as well. Those are not going to need it at this point. Don't worry about those. So we're going to select our expense reports table, which is the table that we just created a few minutes ago. And perhaps an important step here that we should note is that we have a node path for the table. And that may be a little bit confusing. So what does that mean? That means that we need a root. In our case, we are just starting out mapping this form. So we're just going to select the root node of the form, which is my expense report. In an example that is coming up in a few minutes, we're not going to be choosing this node, but you'll see why in a few minutes. So I'll just double click on this in the task pane, and that's going to load my node path. And now this next link that I see here is called add column. So I can click add column. It adds another row. And now we kind of start to see the how the database map is getting built. We have our SQL table on the left with our columns below it. We have our InfoPath root node here at the top, and then the InfoPath form node paths, the X paths, right below it. So you basically are going to start filling these rows out one by one. For the first column name, when we check the drop down, we see that all of the columns that we added to our table are available. So let's just take the start date, and you'll see that this DB type is labeled in red, in a red rectangle. The reason for this is DBXL tried to automatically determine the data type, but it failed to do so. So it gives us this drop down so we can check the correct one. So we can select the correct one, date time. And now to the right, we have to click on this icon, and it's going to bring up the InfoPath Forms schema, and we can simply find our start date and double click on it, and it's going to populate the path right here. You'll notice that this path is relative to the root path. So we have mapped one column. So let's add a whole bunch of columns, and I'm just going to start mapping all the other ones. So we have a report date, we have a purpose, we have a manager name, expense code, end date, oops, I need more, employee name, employee email, employee identification number. Okay, so those are all my columns. And you'll see that in a lot of these data types, DBXL automatically determined that these are strings. The ones that it wasn't able to determine, we can just select the correct data type. We know what the data type is because we created the table. And then we can go through and select our node paths. So it's simply double clicking on the node that we want to select. Sorry, I know this is a little boring here, but I'll finish in just a couple more clicks. Okay, So that's our full mapping. We have all our columns on the left. We have our XPaths on the right. There's one thing that we missed. The thing that we missed is the key column. If you notice, the key column here in the middle, nothing is checked. None of these are our key. Our key is the doc ID. In order to perform any mapping from DBXL to SQL, we need a key. You're not going to be able to save. If we try to save, we're going to get an error. The following table has no identity column and no column specified as a primary key or foreign key. So DBXL is smart enough to tell us that we need to add a column. Here's our doc ID. You can see that DBXL automatically said, that's our key. And then for our XPath, these right here are the nodes in our form. Let me collapse those so that you can focus on these DBXL mapping tokens at the top. There's a lot of those here, and we're going to get to those in a minute. But the one we want for now is just the doc ID. So now when we try to save, DBXL is not going to complain. DBXL is going to accept this mapping and save it. And that's our mapping. Now, how can we verify that the mapping is working? Well, we have a document that we already submitted. Right? If we go to SQL and just perform a SQL's trying to create a new table. So if we just perform a select on that table, we're going to see that there are no items. 0 rows right here. So I will go back to the DBXL administration tool. This is the document that we had previously submitted. I'm going to check the checkbox for it, and I'm going to click reshred. So DBXL tells me one document reshredded with 0 error. So what does reshredding mean? Reshredding means that DBXL takes the current document, feeds it through the database mapping to make sure that the data in SQL is up to date. So if I perform this same select again, let me just simplify the statement. So if I perform that select again, there's our data. There's our doc ID, the purpose, the 3 dates, the expense code, manager name, my email, and the employee identification number is null. Why is that? If we go back to the form that we have submitted, what we're going to see is that the employee identification number is blank. So DBXL has nothing that it can map to that SQL column. So let's just give this a few seconds to load and confirm that the ID number is blank. There it is. Our ID number is blank. So let's say that my ID number is some number that I just made up, and I will submit that. The form gets submitted, and if I refresh here, I'm going to see that the version number increased to version 3. And if I re-execute my query, there's my employee identification number. Great. So this is an example of the most basic SQL mapping that you can set up. Now, what can you do with this data? Well, let's say that you have a reporting process. I'm not going to get into SQL reporting services, but I'm going to just show you what we can do in Excel, for example. We can go to Data, from other sources, SQL Server. The server name is this. And Windows authentication is probably okay for my case. So there are a lot of things here. Let me select the right database and select the expense reports table. And there are, if you click next, the data connection wizard has other options, but I'm just going to finish and let this data load. And there it is. So that's the data in our form, but submitted to SQL, displayed in SQL. So let me just quickly show you how this would work in a real-life scenario. Let's say that you have this Excel report, and let's say that tomorrow somebody opens the form, submits some more data, so I submit some more data, and that data gets submitted to DBXL. It's going to show up as version 1. That data is going to be pushed out to SQL. And if our user who has Excel set up with this data connection refreshes the data connection, that new item gets pulled in here. So there's nothing to do in the server. There's no task. There's no calendar. This is all done immediately. So instantaneously, when the form data gets submitted, it gets pushed out to SQL, and then it can be queried by a report such as this one that I'm showing you in Excel right now. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about the flexibility that this scenario allows us. Let's say that a few months go by and somebody decides that you no longer need the employee email in this table. So you just come here, you delete the column, and let's say somebody tells you, instead of the employee column, I need the department. I think we had a department in the form. Let me just check real quick. Okay, that's taking too long. Let me just assume. There it is. There's our department. Okay. So there's my department. Let's say, so instead of the employee email field, we need a department. So you can add that to the SQL table, save it. You come back to DBXL, to the database tab, and you take a look at your mapping and you say, okay, well, the employee email, that's not needed anymore. So let me just delete that. Let me add a column. This dropdown is still showing employee email, so I actually need to refresh the database. There's my department now showing up. And here is my department. So there's my updated mapping, and I save it. So great, you've done that change, and now, if somebody executes this query, they're going to not have the employee email, but they have this null department. So the way to fix that is you just come here and you say, well, I'm just going to reshred all of my documents. So there's a button here called reshred all. It'll go through and it'll make sure that the data in SQL is up to date. So if I re-execute my query, I'll see that department show up. The previous document that I submitted didn't have a department, so that's why that one's showing null. So let's say that you tell that person, hey, you didn't fill out the department in that form, go and fill it out. The user is going to open the form that they had previously submitted. They're going to type in their department and submit. And now when I re-execute the query in SQL, there's my department. So the point of illustrating this is there was no change in the form itself, right? The form is collecting data, and DBXL is mapping that data to SQL. The only piece that we changed is the way that DBXL maps that data to SQL. So if tomorrow you decide that you want to add another few columns here to map the employee email, map the manager email, map some of the other fields that we have, then you can do that. It's not going to affect the data that's in there. It's not going to affect your form. Once you're done updating the mapping, you just come here and click reshred all and you're done. The data's in SQL. However, so far, the only thing we have covered is this, this set of data that we could call the parent. So it's the employee information, the manager information, and then these dates, right, and the purpose. We haven't touched the items, and the reason is the items are a repeating node. It is a repeating group. So how do we map this to SQL? So that's the next few minutes we're going to talk about this. We're going to explain how to map this repeating information into SQL. And just to re-emphasize, there's no change in the InfoPath form. So I'm gonna close Designer. Just there's no magic happening here. There's no change to the InfoPath form at all. What I do need is I need a new table, because I need a relationship between the two tables. So you can call it a parent and child relationship. So this is my child table. My child table is going to have information like well, I guess I do need the form in design mode so I can see what the fields are. So my child table is going to have this information in the items group. So we have a date, we have a description, amount, category, let's say that's enough, right? Let's say that's enough for now. We need a couple of more things. We need to have a column that links us back to the parent table. This is a foreign key. So for every parent, so for every expense report, we might have multiple items. So what we can say here is let's have an expense report ID. So this expense report ID is going to tell us which expense report this item belongs to. And this is an integer because we know the doc ID is an integer. And we know it cannot be null because, well, every form that gets submitted has a doc ID. And it's our key, so it cannot be null. The other question we encounter here is the question of a unique key. We don't have a primary key. Date is not unique. Description, there's no guarantee that that's unique. You know, amount, category, certainly we can't assume that any of those are unique. Expense report ID, like I said, we could have multiple items for every expense report, so that's obviously not going to be a unique value. So we have to sort of manufacture one. But we don't have one in our data, so we have to manufacture one. And this is an alternative, right? This is going to let SQL keep track of the key. So we'll just call this item ID. And it's not null, and it is our key. And we're going to go here to this frame here in the bottom and find identity specification and set that to yes. So what that means is SQL is going to manage that column. SQL is just going to auto increment that column from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And it's a key, and it's unique, and it works. Every SQL table needs this. So let's save our table. This is called expense report items. So once it's saved, we can return to the DBXL administration tool. And again, we'll click refresh database because our database schema has changed. So now we can click this link here called add subtable. Add subtable is going to allow us to add the child table. So when we come here to this table name dropdown, we're going to see the expense report items. And we're going to be faced with this question. What is our root node path? In the parent table, we simply selected the root node of our InfoPath form. That's not valid in this case because we're dealing with repeating data. So in order for the repeating data to be mapped correctly, we need to make sure that we are selecting the node path for the repeating node. So if we review our InfoPath form design, you'll see that the item group is repeating. Item. So that's what we're selecting here. Item. So this is really crucial. If you don't select the repeating node, the mapping's going to fail. You're not going to get the child items mapped correctly. So really 100% make sure that you're selecting the correct repeating node. The other key thing in establishing this relationship between the parent and the child is that we need a foreign key. We already defined that in SQL. Recall that we added this column here, expense report ID. So let's select that here, expense report ID. And we have to link that to a column from the parent. So from the parent, we have the doc ID column. So that's pretty simple. Now, we can just add the columns. So we're going to map the amount, we're going to map the category, we're going to map the date, and we're going to map the description. So again, we'll select the right data type here, and then we'll go through and select the correct nodes here. So you'll notice that my amount is relative to this, and then this, my item is relative to the root. So these are all relative paths. So I'll just go through here and use the task pane to finish selecting my XPaths. That looks complete. You might be asking yourself, why did I not check any key in my child table? And the reason is simple. The reason is I defined a key that SQL is going to manage. It's an auto increment column. So DBXL has no business with that column. DBXL doesn't need that column. DBXL is going to detect that SQL has control over that, and it's going to yield control to that to SQL, and DBXL is not going to worry. So when we saved the parent without a key, it complained. But now that we save the child without a key, it's going to go through and it's going to save without a problem. Again, the important thing is that there's a primary key defined. It doesn't matter whether you define it in SQL or you define it here in the mapping, but there has to be a key. So if you don't want to map the doc ID, you're not required to. There's other ways to do that. But just make sure there's a key. So now that we have this set up, you might be wondering, well, what about our data? So I want to show you these queries. You're going to see that the child table is blank. The child table has no data. But what we can do is we can click on Reshred All Documents. And then once we return to SQL and execute, we're going to see our items in this table. Okay, so we are now mapping all of our data into the parent and the child table. So let me generate a new report to show you a potential problem, and then I'll show you a potential fix. So I'm going to open a new one, new form, and I'm going to be very what's the right word? I'm going to be a very, very bad employee. I'm going to fill out nothing. I'm just going to submit. So DBXL is going to accept that document. All right. The only field that I filled out was the one required field. So DBXL is going to accept that document, and then when we go to SQL, we're going to have a problem. I think we got a shredding error, which is great, because now we can take a look at the shredding error. Yeah, so see, our database is expecting a value in our purpose column. And I know why that is. It's because I updated the form, but I forgot to reattach it. There we go. I made purpose required, and I just forgot to reattach it here. So let me allow InfoPath to detect the new version of the form. Usually takes it a few seconds here. There we go. Okay. I just wanted InfoPath to detect that so that I can come back to my, let's call it, junk form that has no data. It's just blank. And I'm going to reopen it, and the purpose field is going to have a red asterisk next to it telling me that it's required. Right here. So this is a purpose. So I'll submit that. I wonder if I updated the wrong form. Well, let's wait for InfoPath to respond here. Let's see. I think I might have used the wrong form when I made my previous change. That's not a problem. I'll just check this as required. Cannot be blank. and I'll save it, and I'll reattach it here. Sorry about that. I just attached the form that still sends email. So let's let InfoPath detect the new version again. Okay, and I will return to my junk XML here that has no information. So that I can fill out a purpose, because purpose is required. It's required in the form, and it's required in the database as well. Okay. So we'll resubmit that. So now when we return to SQL, okay, so there's our problem, right? I filled out a purpose. Purpose was the only thing that DBXL was expecting. Now that DBXL has that purpose, it's mapping, but it has null, 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 and then in the items it has all nulls. So this is a big problem. You have somebody who filled out the form incorrectly, filled out the form incompletely, and you have some bad data in SQL. So how can you prevent this? The solution is to add a conditional mapping. So if we return to our database tab, we can add a condition here. And I'm illustrating how conditional mapping can help you with dealing with bad data, but you might be filtering, you might perform a filter on a value. You know, maybe you only care about items that are over $100. Maybe you only want to map data that's for a specific expense code, and so on, right? So there's all sorts of conditions that could be built here. I'm just illustrating one. So the condition that I'm going to add here is, let's say that I want to add two conditions. One for my items. Let's say I want the amount to be greater than 0. So I'm just going to type this in. It's really that simple. My amount is greater than 0. And let's say that for the expense report itself, I want, let's just say that I want an employee name at least, right? Because the employee name is essential. So this is the syntax for not blank. It's exclamation mark equal double quote, double quote. And I need to close that bracket. Okay, so what I've done is I added a condition here. What I expect to happen is that DBXL is not going to map data when the employee name is blank. And here I expect DBXL is not going to map data when the amount is, when the amount is equal to 0 or less than 0, or blank, I guess. Let me save that. To put that change into action, I'm just going to reshred all the documents. And once I go into SQL, I have this null row. Once I refresh the query, you'll see that the null rows went away, because DBXL is identifying those rows as not fulfilling these conditions, and therefore it's not mapping them. So one thing I want to briefly touch on next are the DBXL tokens. We mapped the DBXL doc ID right here. However, we have a DBXL link, we have a doc type, a ref ID, a version number, created by, created date, modified by, modified date. So there's a lot of data in here that you could use. This version number is the same version number as you'll find in the Documents tab. Sorry, I have to switch there to show you this version number. The ref ID is this ref ID. The Doc type is this name right here, expense report underscore Ernesto. And then created by, date created, modified by, and date modified are pretty self-explanatory. DBXL link is a URL to your form. So you can map that to the database. You can have that URL in your database if you need to. So let's just illustrate that with one quick example here. I'm just going to modify expense report here and add DBXL URL. And a URL can be pretty long, so let me make this a bit longer. I'll save that table change and I'll return to DAT, refresh the database, and I'll just add that column and I'll map that DBXL link. Once the save is changed, we can reshred, and then our command in SQL is going to have this column with the URL. So it's just a nifty trick. Those are pretty common common tokens, common values you might need. So it's a good idea to have those handy if you need them. So let me induce an error. I want to induce an error to show you how we handle errors. I'm going to fill out a form. And I'm going to be doing so in a way that creates a conflict with one of these data types. So let's say expense code. I defined it as having 10 characters in SQL. Sorry, the web service is trying to connect here. Sorry, wasn't expecting a timeout here. Maybe there's something else going on the server. Anyway, what I want to create is a new form. I'm going to fill out a purpose. I'm going to just have an email address. And the key that I want to... I don't know why I'm being asked to upgrade. Sorry. Let's try that again. The key that I want to illustrate here is having an expense code that is longer than expected. So that's a good 13 characters. So let me submit that. That's going to generate an error. The form isn't going to complain. There's no error in the form itself, right? If the form submits to DBXL, and DBXL is more than happy to accept this data. The problem comes when DBXL tries to map that data to SQL. So I'm just going to check this document and reshred it, and an error is going to come up, or not. Expense code 10. Well, I thought I entered more than 10 characters. Oh, I know what happened. It's because my condition is preventing that form from shredding. So DBXL hasn't tried to shred it yet. So let me fulfill that condition. My condition was this. Okay. So again, no error here. The user isn't notified, right? DBXL accepts the form. DBXL is going to store the form. When DBXL tries to shred that form, it's going to say, I can't shred that because one of the form's values was too large or could not be converted to the correct data type. Okay, so the error happened in the background. You don't know about it. The user doesn't know about it. How do we expose that error to the user? If we go back to the database tab, there's a checkbox called report shredding errors to the form user. That's already checked by default. You can uncheck it if you want, but it's checked by default. In order to make use of that, we need to make a very small change in the form. So let me open the form in design mode and make that small change. Now the change is this. We're going to go to the data connections wizard and we're going to modify our submit data connection. There is a second web service which is DBXL document service, but with an E and an X at the end. And this means that it's going to throw exceptions. It's going to show the users information about their errors. So I'm just going to change that. And I'm just going to step through the data connection wizard. And I won't need to change anything else in the data connection wizard. All the parameters are still going to be there. So if we look here, everything is still set. So that's it. That's all we need to do. I'm going to save that and reattach it to my document type in DBXL. So, and now I'm going to reopen that form, which is the one that returned an error. And I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to click submit again. And when I click submit again, it's going to throw an error. Or not. Because I haven't allowed InfoPath to upgrade the template. So let me do that. Let's give it a few seconds here. Okay, it's not wanting to upgrade. That's okay though. We can force it. Here's a trick. You go to the InfoPath filler. You find the form. What's it called? Expense report. Let me see if I can find that. Sorry. Might be this one, but that's a strange name. Okay, let's just get update of that form. Okay. Let's try that again. So if the form upgraded correctly in my cache, in my InfoPath cache, then when I try to submit, I'm going to get an error back. So there must be something going on. Let me check that, yep, this form is correct. I'm going to save it under a different name and reattach it here. Sorry, sometimes the InfoPath cache is a tricky business. There we go. I don't need to save it, I just want to reopen my form here. Okay. There we go. So there's our error. So we are telling the user an error occurred saving form data to the database, right? As a result, the data has not been shared to the database. Your typical user probably doesn't need to see this much error reporting. The reason I like to show this is because this is a good setup for testing. So as you're developing the form, as you're having users test it, this gives you an idea of what typical things might go wrong. So here you get a form value that is too large, right? So you can say, aha, well, I need to modify the expense code field so that it doesn't allow this many characters. And once you're ready to deploy the form into production, then you can remove that error, right? That error reporting, because you don't want it. You typically don't want to, disturb the users with that type of error. But during debugging, during testing, it's really powerful to have that, to figure out what's going on, to figure out possible issues. And we have come to the end of Module 2. Thank you